All right, everybody, we need to wrap up our lecture for module number 6. Module 6, of course, is the substance-related and addictive disorders. And in the first two videos, we talked about briefly the substance-induced disorders and also the substance use disorders. And that brings us to this very final brief part of this section of the DSM-5, and it is what we would call the non-substance disorders and non-substance addictions. And so let me just give you an example. Maybe you've had this experience. This was my very first experience many, many years ago when I was in graduate school studying and getting my master's degree in counseling. One of the things that I had to do as a part of my degree was one night a week I had to facilitate a men's, what we call a process group. So this was a community counseling center in the city where I was going to school, and people could come up and for a low cost or a low fee, they could come and attend a group or individual counseling or whatever it may be. And I did both some individual counseling and some group counseling as a part of my clinical training back in the day. And when I was leading my group one night, I remember distinctly a man about 30, 35 came. It's the first time he had ever come. And when I asked him as the facilitator what kind of brought him to the group and what he wanted to talk about, he described just a lot of marital problems. He and his wife had been married for about 5 or 6 years, and he just began to describe how really what brought him was he did not know what to do. They were having multiple problems and issues. She would not come for counseling. He had tried to get her to come to counseling, and she would not come for counseling. And we began to kind of talk a little bit. And I remember him talking about how she had this problem. He didn't know what to do with it. And he finally started talking about how she was a shopaholic. And many of the men in the group kind of snickered and laughed a little bit. I kind of even had that kind of response at first, unfortunately, because we sometimes kind of talk, especially about women, but not just women, but sometimes with women who shop a lot and like to shop and buy clothes or whatever it may be. And so at first we thought that he was joking. And I finally realized that he wasn't joking. He was serious. He went into great detail that night about his wife's behavior, her shopping behavior. And he kept saying, it's an addiction. She's addicted. He said, I'm not joking. She's addicted. He said, she hides stuff from me. He said, she will not go to work. And instead of going to work, she'll go and she'll shop. She will buy multiple things that we already have. And then when I confront her, she says, I didn't buy that. And it's laying right in front of her. He said, she's like an addict. She's like in denial. And I don't know what to do. And we kind of talked a little bit in the group. And after the group dismissed, we did our best to kind of help him and give him some feedback. And as the group dismissed, he kind of lingered. And after everybody left, he kind of cornered me in a good way. And he said, listen, I really need help. He said, no offense. He said, I don't know what to do. He said, I don't want to get a divorce, but that's where we're headed. And he said, I know I've got my own issues, but she has a problem and I can't get anyone to help me understand how to help her. And so we began to talk kind of in private. And I went and found one of our supervisors, one of the PhD students in our program. I went and found him and brought him over. And he had a background in addictions counseling that the supervisor did, sort of our clinical supervisor. And he began to talk. The three of us began to talk. And in about 30 minutes or so, we were able to give that man some referrals. And one of the things I didn't even know was that a large church that was nearby had groups on Wednesday nights, all these 12-step, kind of faith-based 12-step groups. And there was a group for kind of a 12-step group for sexual addiction. There was a 12-step group for gambling addiction. There was a 12-step group for shopping addiction. There was a 12-step group for eating and food addiction. There was a 12-step group like for love and relationships. And I really, at that time in my training and my experience, I really had never considered the idea that people could be addicted to a non-substance. I was very familiar with addiction as far as drugs and alcohol, but that was kind of back in the day when we were still kind of coming around to this idea that addiction can look a lot of different ways. And so that's kind of what brings us to this conversation about gambling disorder. With the DSM-5, with the publication of the DSM-5, we have the very first, the one and the only process addiction, or we may call it a behavioral addiction, or a non-substance addiction that has finally been researched well enough that it has been added to the DSM-5 as a mental health condition, substance abuse condition, gambling disorder. Now, gambling behavior is just one of actually many different behavioral or process addictions that we sometimes see in counseling today. I've mentioned several of them just now. We believe sometimes people can have addictive kind of behavior sexually. We know that people can have gaming or internet or technology addiction, or they can have food addiction, or sometimes it can be a pornography addiction. The relationship kinds of addictions, this idea where, in non-substances, more in behavioral kinds of issues, people can engage in behavior with addictive qualities, so to speak. And so that conversation I had with that guy after my group was kind of my first introduction into this idea we call a process addiction. Well, fast forward now many, many years later, and today we're very, very well and very, very familiar with the idea that addiction can look lots and lots of different ways. So in this section of the addictive disorders and substance use disorders, there is this one process addiction called gambling disorder. Now, again, that doesn't mean that gambling disorder is the most common process addiction. It doesn't mean it's the most severe, the most debilitating as far as why it's in the DSM. It just means that this is the one that we probably have the most research and understanding of. And my hunch is as we go forward, we may have many other behavioral addictions that kind of join or are added to the DSM-5. So those of you who are going to go forward and do drug and alcohol counseling, we oftentimes see gambling issues there. But even if you don't do drug and alcohol counseling, if you're going to work in social services, in just general social services, gambling is a growing issue that we're seeing. And this idea of a gambling addiction, what the DSM-5 would call gambling disorder. So let me just review with you really, really quickly. I'll give you in the PowerPoint and the lecture notes the 9 core symptoms of gambling disorder. And then it's got kind of a 10th symptom, which is more like a qualifier. So symptom number 1 of gambling disorder, so there's about 9 of these. And what we would look for would be about 3 or 4 of these consistently in over about a year's period. Number 1 symptom of gambling disorder is, again, a repetitive pattern of increased gambling behavior. So this idea where someone is over time spending more time gambling or more money or more money gambling. So it kind of starts there. It's kind of that's kind of the first symptom. The second thing that we see with a lot of behavioral addictions is a person, sort of like we also see with substance addictions, that when the person is not gambling, that they are edgy, easily angered, and irritable until they can gamble, or they are defensive when you question them about their gambling. In this case, we'll say gambling. And so that symptom of easily irritable, agitated, and angry when I'm not gambling, almost like I got to have my fix, almost like I got to have my relief, and gambling serves that for me. So that second symptom of when I'm not gambling, I'm often edgy, irritable, and easily angered. Third, similar to a substance use disorder, because again, this has kind of an addictive kind of quality to it with gambling. There are patterns of unsuccessful attempts to cut back or to quit. And so part of what we see with addictive kinds of things is people have a lack of self-control. And many times they want to stop or they've tried to stop, but they've not been able to. Number 4, the 4th symptom is kind of almost like what we call a behavioral craving. So we talked about craving a little bit with substance use disorders. A behavioral craving would be with gambling. Even when I'm not gambling, I'm thinking about it. Even when I'm not gambling, I'm planning for it. Even when I'm not gambling, I'm fantasizing about it, which we also see, by the way, too, with substance use disorders. But this symptom with gambling, sort of a gambling addiction, even when I'm not gambling, I'm kind of wishing I was. I'm kind of craving, so to speak. Just like someone who struggles with alcohol abuse, craves alcohol and sometimes is thinking about when they can drink and sometimes even fantasizing about drinking. The same is true for someone with a gambling disorder. They're fantasizing or craving it even when they're not doing it. The next one is this idea, which we see with many, many behavioral addictions and substance addictions as well too. And it just is this: the person often gambles when feeling depressed or distressed. So kind of the idea with behavioral addictions, sort of like substance addictions too, is that the behavior has a soothing quality. And so oftentimes what you'll see with behavioral addictions is, I have a bad day at work, so I go do this. My wife and I have a fight, so I go do this. I'm not doing well this week, so I go do. So it's kind of like an escape. It's kind of a soothing kind of a pattern. But we oftentimes see that with behavioral addictions where people will oftentimes be drawn to kind of go back or to continue, especially when they feel depressed or distressed. Under stress, kind of a stress relief, or depressed. We oftentimes see kind of that pattern as well too. One of the hooks with gambling addiction, one of the metaphors we use in drug and alcohol counseling is this idea of a hook. And substances can get their hooks into us physically and also emotionally and psychologically. Well, some of these behaviors that we can become addicted to also get their hooks in us. And one of the hooks that we see with gambling is let's just say hypothetically, I go to the casino and I gamble, I lose $500. Well, that's not good. Losing $500 is not good. So what am I going to do about that? Well, one of the temptations of gambling is, well, if I got a little bit more money in my pocket, I can gamble that and get that $500 back. Well, then I gamble, now I've lost $700. Well, that's not good. That's even worse. And so there's this snowball effect. So kind of the idea with the gambling disorder is there's this repeated pattern of going back to try to catch up and get even, to get square, basically, right? So this pattern of trying to get even, and we're coming back even after I lose. Well, I want to come back and try to win more to cover my losses. So that pattern that we often see, that kind of that snowball effect, that negative, nasty cycle that we can often see in gambling is another possible. All these are possible symptoms, right? Also, too, like with many other kind of addictive kinds of things, another feature of gambling disorder would be patterns of deceit or lying in order to cover up what I'm doing or how much money I'm gambling or how many losses I've had. So secrecy, you know that from some of your other classes maybe. One of the characteristic signs of an addiction is secrecy. And so anything that I feel ashamed of, that I want to hide, is usually a red flag warning sign, right? And so with gambling disorder, because again, it's kind of an addiction, there's patterns of lying or covering my tracks as far as what I'm doing and how much money I'm spending, how much money I'm losing is another common thing that we see in gambling. The eighth one is one that's very, very similar to what we already talked about earlier with substance use disorder. And that's just this idea that because of my gambling, I experience significant problems in relationships, at work, career opportunities have been given up or lost, relationships have been lost as a direct result of my gambling behavior is another possible common symptom. And then the last one, the ninth one, is which is again is very typical if you think about it, it's kind of logical, is because of my gambling, I'm having to rely on other people for money. So patterns of borrowing money to cover my gambling losses or to pay my bills because I don't have money to pay my bills because of my gambling. So being distressed financially and kind of relying on other people to always kind of bail me out. Patterns of that would be like the last possible symptom that we might see with gambling disorder. And then the 10th, really it's not a symptom, it's a qualifier. And here's kind of the key thing. So let's put gambling disorder with something else we talked about earlier this semester. You may remember back when we talked about the mood disorders, we talked about bipolar 1 and bipolar 2 disorders, manic mood and hypomanic mood. And you may remember that one of the features of manic or hypomanic mood at times can be impulsive, risky behavior, impulsive choices and engagement in risky behavior where there's a high potential for negative consequences. I think that's the way the DSM says it. So gambling kind of fits there. And so not everyone gambles when their mood is manic. But one of the things we often see with problem gamblers is they have bipolar disorder. And when their mood is stable, they aren't tempted to go and gamble. But when their mood is high or manic or hypomanic, they're off their medication, they're having a full-blown manic episode. Oftentimes we know when that happens, people are impulsively drawn to risky, risk-taking kinds of behavior, sexually purchasing, buying things, travel, drug use, but gambling kind of fits in there. So one of the key things the DSM is kind of clear about is gambling disorder is not a diagnosis that we would give to someone if we felt that the main reason why they gamble is because they have bipolar disorder. And so as a result of their manic or hypomanic mood, that's why they oftentimes lose money to gambling. So gambling disorder would be a diagnosis we would use in a situation where someone's gambling behavior is more persistent regardless of their mood. If it only is kind of connected to a manic phase or manic episode, it could just be simply an expression of bipolar disorder. And so that's an important qualifier as well there too. So it's a good way for us to kind of bring in another idea, another disorder we've talked about in this class with gambling. So with this one. So this one and this only process disorder, behavioral disorder, diagnosis, addiction that we see in the DSM, gambling disorder. I want you to be familiar with that. And like I said, as we go forward in time in future editions of the DSM, We may have other of these process addictions that are also added as well too. So that wraps up our little videos for Module 6. Come back for Module 7. We're moving on to personality disorders in Module number 7. I will see you then.